The night I laid down my mourning feather, a whisper rewrote my fate. The memory of that night begins not with firelight or silence, but with the sight of a feather slipping from my hand. It spun downward in slow, deliberate spirals, as though every turn carved something out of me, until it landed among the glowing stone. The hiss was faint but final, the sound of something ending, though I could not yet name what. Around me the council sat in absolute silence, their faces caught between shadows and flame. This was meant to be my release, the moment I surrendered grief and walked back into life. That was what tradition promised. Yet as I stared at that feather darkening against the stone, a sharp truth pressed against me. I did not feel lighter. I felt stolen from. If this ritual was meant to grant peace, why did it feel like loss? The ground beneath my knees was iron cold, numbing my legs until they no longer felt like my own. Smoke coiled upward, thick with cedar and char, burning in my throat when I tried to breathe. I lifted my head, though I knew I should not. Widows were supposed to lower their gaze, to bow as shadows among the living, but I could not. My eyes roamed the circle, searching for a crack, a kindness, something I could cling to. I found only judgment. Some faces held pity, others envy, but more than a few waited with an almost hungry patience for me to break. They wanted silence to consume me because silence had consumed all who came before. Why then did my heart fight so hard against it? That was when I felt it, a warmth against my ear, so sudden that I froze. It was not the fire's breath, nor the cut of the winter wind. It was human, deliberate, so close it stole the air from my lungs. A voice threaded through the crackle of the flames, so low that I almost believed it had risen from inside me. "You're free." 2 words, that was all. Yet they cracked through the ritual, louder than the fire's hiss, louder than the murmurs of my people, louder than the weight of every rule that bound me. My pulse surged, beating so violently I thought surely others must hear it, but they did not. Their eyes remained locked on the fire, as if nothing had shifted at all. Only I had heard him, only I had been chosen for this secret. Who was he to speak such words in such a place? The feather smoldered faintly, smoke curling upward like a spirit, but I hardly saw it. My lips parted, trembling, a whisper barely born. "Why?" The fire snapped loudly, nearly swallowing the sound, but the voice leaned closer, so near I could almost feel the shape of his mouth as he answered. "Because if you stay, they'll bury you alive in his name." The earth itself seemed to tilt beneath me. His words were no stranger's fancy, they were the truth I had hidden from myself. Widowhood here was no survival. It was a slow burial, a suffocation disguised as honor. The feather was not a token of freedom. It was a chain, binding me to silence for the rest of my days. My chest heaved as I tried to breathe, but breath carried no air. What manner of man would risk his place, perhaps his life, to tell me such a thing in the heart of the council fire? An elder's staff struck the earth, sharp and final. The ritual was sealed. By every law of this place, I was finished. Yet the presence behind me did not withdraw. If anything, it pressed closer, and before I could rise or move, the night itself shattered. The sound of hoofbeats rolled over the hills, faint at first but swelling with each heartbeat until the ground trembled beneath me. The council stirred, torches lifted, voices whispered unease. Riders were gathering, but not for ceremony. This was the sound of pursuit, of something coming with speed and intent. Why would hunters rise now, when the ritual had barely ended? The man behind me moved, his hand brushed against mine, and my body jolted. I had not been touched since the day they lowered my husband into the ground. No, one had dared to close that distance, to break that silence. The touch was not cruel, but it was certain, and in that certainty I felt the shocking reminder that I was still flesh, still alive, still capable of feeling. Should I cry out? Should I recoil? Instead I froze. The living craved the living, and in that stolen touch my body betrayed me with its willingness to be carried. The hand tightened. He pulled me one step from the stones, his grip urgent, unyielding. I glanced back to the fire. The council's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. They would see us within moments. My voice broke out of me in a hoarse whisper, a plea wrapped in fear. "Who are you?" But he gave no answer, only silence, and the steady pull toward the dark beyond the flames. Why would he risk everything for me, yet hide his own name? The horns blared, deep, guttural, vibrating in my ribs. Not mourning horns, hunting horns. Chaos erupted, torches waved, riders mounted with urgent shouts. The law had awakened, and it was not coming for ritual, it was coming for us. The stranger pulled harder. My feet stumbled across frozen grass and jagged roots. Smoke stung my eyes. My breath tore ragged through my throat as the council fire shrank behind us. My mind screamed to stop, to turn back, to beg forgiveness. But his hand drove me onward, and my body obeyed his strength. How far could one man carry me before the riders closed in? Then, through the blur, I saw it, a horse waiting in the shadow, black as midnight. Its breath steamed in the cold, its muscles restless beneath its hide. The torchlight flickered in its eyes, making them burn like gold before vanishing again. It pawed the ground, impatient, as if it already knew we belonged on its back. Terror clawed up my throat. "No," I gasped, shaking my head. "If we run, they will kill us." But the man did not listen. He moved with the strength of someone who had made this decision long before tonight. His arm swept around me, and suddenly I was weightless, pulled up against the leather of the saddle. The ground fell away, and before I could even draw another breath, the horse surged forward. The night exploded into chaos. Wind ripped across my face, tearing tears from my eyes. The earth shook with each pounding hoof. The fire vanished behind us, shrinking to a faint glow. But the cries of riders and the blare of horns thundered ever closer. I clung to the saddle, my muscles straining, my mind unraveling with each jolt of the horse's stride. Was this escape, or a different kind of capture? Through the storm of noise and motion, the whisper came again, rougher this time, almost breaking with the speed of the ride. "You're free." The words wrapped around me, not as a question, not as a temptation, but as a vow. But freedom is never free. As the dark swallowed us whole, a cold certainty pressed into me deeper than the winter air. The horns behind us were not sounding for one widow and one scout. They were the first cry of something far larger, a net already closing, a conspiracy I could not yet see. What price had already been set in motion by a single whisper at the firestone? The horse thundered beneath me, every stride like the crack of storm against earth. Yet louder still were the words that clung to me like fire to dry grass. "You're free." He had whispered them as if they were contraband, smuggled into the night, too dangerous for any other soul to hear. They repeated themselves in my chest, echoing louder than the hooves, louder than the horns that still brayed in the distance. Was this freedom, or the first step into exile? The wind slashed across my face, sharp with the smell of pine and distant smoke, tearing my breath in broken fragments. My hands clawed for something to hold, leather biting into my palms as I gripped the saddle. The stranger's arm was braced firm against me, steadying me as though I were nothing but a child carried through the storm. My body resisted, trembling at his strength, yet my heart betrayed me with a shameful truth. The touch felt alive. It had been too long since I had felt life pressing against mine. But was that warmth salvation, or temptation designed to unravel me? The fire behind us dimmed into a shrinking star, but voices carried far into the night, urgent and growing nearer. Torches speckled the ridge, bobbing like angry spirits pursuing us. The law had taken form, my kin, my counsel, my own people chasing me as though I had already chosen rebellion. My throat tightened. What crime had I committed, except breathing in the wrong word? If my feather marked me a widow, did his whisper mark me a fugitive? The stranger shifted, leaning forward, and in the strained glow of fleeing firelight, I caught the first glimpse of his face. His jaw was sharp, shadowed by days without rest, and his eyes dark, restless, searching the horizon as if hunted even before tonight struck me colder than the wind. This was not a council man. This was not even an outcast of my village. The name rose unbidden from whispers I had heard long ago. stories of a scout who moved like shadow and defied the council's chain. Rowan Creed, the realization cut through me. He was outlaw, dangerous, trusted by no council, belonging to no hearth. His name carried curses and warnings in equal measure. And now, here I was, carried on his horse, my feather burned, my vow broken. How could I follow him without damning myself? And yet, how could I leap away without being trampled by the law that thundered behind me? The ground sloped downward, the horse stumbling slightly on the frost-hardened earth. Rowan steadied the reins, his body shifting against mine, commanding the animal with practiced strength. He did not look at me, not yet. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead, but his voice broke through the roar of the chase. "You can stay bound to ashes," he said, low enough that only I could hear, "or you can ride where breath still means something." I bit my lip, tasting the copper tang of blood where my teeth broke skin. His words were poison and promise both. Ashes had been my world for too long, but could I believe a man who had no law, no family, no vow? Was his hand an escape or a snare set by someone who lived beyond chain? Behind us, the horns blared again, closer now, the rhythm of hooves shaking the ground. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the torches spilling down the ridge, spreading like fire through dry grass. My chest tightened, faces familiar even at this distance, faces of kin, of brothers, of cousins. I was being hunted by my own. Would they see me as prisoner or willing traitor? Rowan leaned low, the wind carrying his breath against my cheek. "They'll not stop once they've named you mine. Choose quickly, because once they do, no feather or fire will call you back." The words pierced sharper than the cold. Named you mine. That was the unspoken terror. Even if I had not chosen him, even if I had fought him, once they saw me carried at his side, the judgment would already be sealed. In their eyes, my silence would never again be grief. It would be guilt. The torches swarmed closer, and the firelight spilled across the plain like a net. Rowan jerked the reins sharply, and the horse swerved toward the cover of trees at the base of the hill. Branches whipped at us, sharp with ice, scraping against my arms and tearing at my dress. My teeth clenched to stifle a cry. The forest swallowed us in shadow, but it was no safety. The shouts behind us were still closing. The horse heaved, breath frothing in white plumes, and I clung tighter, heart pounding so fast it blurred into the rhythm of the gallop. Rowan's hand found mine again, pressing it to the saddle horn, forcing me to hold when my strength faltered. That touch, steady, insistent, unyielding, burned hotter than fire, but I could not tell if it anchored me or trapped me. Was I still myself, or was I already becoming part of his defiance? The ground leveled, and through the trees I caught the glow of another torch. Not behind us, but ahead. Rowan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tensing. He pulled the horse to a halt, so suddenly I lurched forward against him. My heart slammed. Ahead, voices carried low, scouts cutting off our escape. We were surrounded. The horse pawed, restless, sensing danger. Rowan's grip shifted, his other hand reaching for something hidden beneath his cloak, though I could not see what. He turned to me then for the first time, his eyes catching the faint light, sharp as flint. "You've one choice left, Marin Ashford," he said, his voice like steel wrapped in smoke. "You ride with me, or you let them take you back." The words struck like an arrow. There was no plea in them, no kindness, only demand. He extended his hand fully this time, palm open, fingers waiting. His eyes held mine with the certainty of a man who knew the world would not wait for me to decide. Behind us, the horns bellowed again. Ahead, firelight shifted, voices rising. The forest trembled with the coming storm. Could I trust the outlaw who had whispered freedom, or should I surrender to the law that had already buried me once? I stared at his hand, feeling the pull of the night, the closing of the trap around us. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew the truth. Whether salvation or ruin, the path would be his. And in that moment, with riders closing and the council's fire growing closer, Rowan Creed's hand stretched before me as the only bridge between death and whatever waited beyond. The world seemed to hold its breath as I hovered on the edge of choice. My hand trembled, reaching, hesitating, caught between law and exile. Then the roar of hooves split the forest wide, torches flaring brighter, and I realized there would be no time for hesitation. Rowan's voice cut through the chaos, fierce and final. "Take it now or you'll never be free again." And as I placed my hand in his, the earth itself seemed to vanish beneath me. His fingers wrapped around my wrist with a certainty that left no room for ceremony, and before my fear could gather itself into refusal, he pivoted, drew me forward, and lifted me in a single, practiced motion that pulled the night out from under my feet. The air yanked at my cloak as the saddle rose to meet me, leather slick with cold, and the hollow in my stomach widened into a drop that felt like a rebirth and a fall at once. Because what kind of life begins by abandoning the only law that remembers you existed? He swung up behind me so cleanly that I felt the shift of his weight as a command to the horse rather than to me, his chest a brace at my back, the heat of him warring with the knife-sharp wind. The animal surged, haunches coiling beneath us, and the first stride hit like a bell struck deep in bone. The second found a rhythm. The third braided my breath to the gallop until I couldn't separate my heartbeat from the ground's relentless drum, and I thought, if I am to live, will I learn to breathe at this speed? Branches whipped my shoulders as we knifed through the tree line, brittle twigs snapping against my sleeves, the smell of juniper and frost and startled earth rushing up with each stride as Rowan pressed the horse into a narrow game trail that seemed to appear beneath his eyes rather than under the moon. Behind us the horns dragged their notes long, the sound crawling through the timber like a hunt that had memorized my name, and I wondered who had taught them to call me quarry before I had even learned to call myself free. "Lean with him," Rowan murmured into the edge of my hair as the trail pitched left, the words steady rather than soft, and I let my weight follow the animal's shoulder because my body trusted what my mind didn't, the way children trust water that has not yet taught them to drown. His arm caged the space in front of me, hand low on the reins, and the horse slid past a glossy skein of ice where seepage had frozen into glass, and all I could think was, how many times has he threaded this needle with a life not his own balanced against the saddle bow? Wind salted my lips with cold and old ash as we broke from the trees onto a fallow stretch where grasses lay hammered flat by winter, each blade a little blade in its own right. Torches winked along the ridge behind us like a constellation that had dropped to earth to judge me. Riders' silhouettes cresting and dipping as the horns shifted from the long call to a staccato cadence that meant close, fast, flank wide, cut the valley, and it occurred to me with a sickness I couldn't swallow that someone among them was thinking not like a council elder but like a hunter who already knew the path Rowan Creed favored, which meant whose eyes had been on him before mine. I realized then that my palms were fused to the saddle horn as if it might save me from falling into my own life, and the recognition came like shame and relief tangled together. The last hand to steady me had been a gravedigger's, the last body pressed this near a weight lowered on rope, and the shock of living warmth at my back made my chest ache with something I wasn't ready to call hunger even as it fed on. Was I clutching him because death chased my heels, or because some unburied part of me had survived everything that claimed to have ended me? Rowan guided the horse down into a shallow drainage that cut across the plain, a dry creek whose banks gave us a minute of cover from the ridge where torches scissored against the sky, and for those 60 heartbeats I felt the sound of pursuit dampen the way rain hushes dust, only to return thicker and nearer when we climbed the opposite side. He rode not as if he fled, but as if he placed pieces on a board no one else could see, selecting shadows and angle, hedges of willow and fist-high thickets that broke our outline. If a man thinks like that, what? Debt taught him to count breath in distances and safety in arcs of moon. "Take your left hand under the strap," he said, not looking down, not looking at me, voice a tool he kept sharp for using, "and when I tell you to, shift to your right knee so he can clear the wash." The horse's ears flicked back at his words as if the animal read language from the tendon, and the quiet, and I thought how obedience to him felt like movement instead of surrender, which frightened me more than disobedience had ever done, because when had it become easier to bow to the outlaw's command than to the council's law? He half rose in the stirrups, and the horse jumped a narrow runnel the thaw had abandoned to ice. Shards cracked under the hind hooves like breaking goblets, and cold mist kissed our shins, and then we were pounding along again with steam rising off the animal's shoulders to meet the breath that made ghosts of us all. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, Rowan angled us toward a line of standing cottonwoods whose top branches carried a sound like paper tearing when the wind tore south, and I thought, if the ground keeps remaking itself to his will, what happens the first time it refuses him the courtesy? "You know my name," I said, because saying it was a way to prove I could still shape air to purpose, and I felt his breath shorten almost imperceptibly against the back of my neck before he answered. I made it my business to learn what the council would rather forget. His tone had no pride in it, only a fatigue that belonged to someone who had chased too many truths too long, and I asked the only question that mattered to the ache beneath my ribs. Why me? Which I'd meant as accusation but heard as plea. And isn't that the measure of a life turned, when you can't tell where blame ends and need begins? "Not you alone," he said, "no triumph in it. Only that same bone-deep weariness. But you first." And the words opened a space in me colder than the wind, because first meant after, and after meant others, and others meant this was not a night born of impulse, but a thing assembled and held ready for a signal. And then the horns behind us shifted again, and from the right a second line of torches swung wide to close the plain like hands bringing bread to a blade. If this was a net, then where had it been spun, and whose fingers had measured its mesh to the width of my breath? We hit a strip of ground where frost hadn't held, and the horse's stride punched wet earth into a spray that freckled my boots with dark, and the smell of turned soil rose sweet and animal, and startlingly alive compared to the scorch of the council fire. And at the far edge of that strip, a man's voice lifted and fell in a pattern that was not a shout but a signal, 3 notes and a pause, the kind of thing you use when you've hunted side by side long enough to make language smaller. Who had taught my people to speak like soldiers instead of mourners? And how long had we been practicing a war that pretended to be a ritual? Rowan's hand left the reins for a heartbeat and pressed something small and cold into my palm, and when I curled my fingers around it I felt the thinness of a blade and the thicker comfort of leather wrapped to keep it from slipping when it met blood, and my throat closed on the simple, terrible fact that he had just made me dangerous. "If I fall," he said, "no drama in it, no attempt at comfort. Cut the tether and ride east until you see poplars with a lightning scar halfway up. Ride through that split and don't look left." And all I could think was, east to what? And why should the first map I'm given be written in scars? "I won't leave you," I said, and heard what my voice made of the vow, defiance and terror pretending to be courage, and I felt more than saw his mouth twist in something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite grief. "You say that now," murmured, "but the plains keep receipts," and the phrase folded a shadow into the night that hadn't been there before, the kind cast not by torches but by memory, and I wanted to ask whose debt we had just added my name to, and whether his was the only hand that would be asked to pay. An arrow hissed past my left ear so close it stitched the wind to my hair and buried itself in the river mud we hadn't realized we were skirting, a low swale gone glossy with a skin of thaw, and the horse skittered sideways so violently I lost one stirrup and bit my tongue hard enough to taste iron. Rowan's arm crushed me back against him to keep me from pitching over the pommel, and another arrow thudded into the bank with a sound like a rude knock at a door no one wanted to open. Somewhere out in the dark a rider cursed, a familiar cadence that made my stomach flip, because familiarity here meant kin, and what else is a curse but a prayer that's admitted it has teeth? He angled us toward a line of boulders tumbled from an old cut bank, using their mass to catch the next shot, and as we streaked between them I felt the world narrow to a corridor of stone and breath and the tiny squeal of leather where my glove twisted against the rain. "Trust me," he said, and the words landed not like a plea but like a small, hard task set in my hand. "Breathe now, lean now, hold now, don't break." And I thought of the feather on the stones and how trust had been burned out of me by ritual until tonight, when a stranger told me to borrow it back from my own body, which made me wonder, when did I decide my bones were not mine to command? We climbed a shallow rise at such an angle, I thought the animal must slide backward into the mouths of the men howling up the slope behind us. But the horse found purchase on some hidden seam of earth and powered over the lip, and suddenly there was sky, wide and open and mercilessly clear, and beneath it the plain rolled away in a huge dark sheet, pricked everywhere with moving fire, torches, dozens, scores, a sprawl of light stitched into a half-moon around us, so many that for a breath my mind refused to count, because counting meant believing the answer, and believing meant admitting we had been running not from a village's grief, but from a decision already made at a scale I could not name. "They'll drive us to the flats," Rowan said. "No fear in it, only a surveyor's certainty, because that's where they can see." And when I followed the line of his chin I saw, far off, a gleam like hammered metal where ice still armored the low ground, a distant ribbon that would break if pressed at the wrong place and hold if courted with respect. And I wanted to say no, not the river, because the sound of cracking can turn a life into a silence it never meant to keep. If he trusted the ice, would the ice consent to trust us back? The horse blew hard through his nose, steam curling around my knees, and in the wind between horn calls I heard another sound, thin and almost swallowed, a small bell, the kind you tie to a harness when you need to find something in a blizzard, and it tugged at a memory I couldn't place, a winter, a cart, a promise spoken over a body that hadn't yet learned how to be still. Who out there rode with bells on a hunt for the living, and what did it say about the way this night had been planned that even the echoes had been chosen? "Look," Rowan breathed, and I followed his line not to the river now but to the left flank of the half-moon, where the torches thickened around a rider who didn't wave his light, but held it steady, the flame a steady gold coin cupped in a hand that didn't tremble, and the others kept their distance the way geese fingertip the shape of air around a lead. I couldn't see the man's face, but his posture read command, and the shape of his shoulders pulled at some old recognition I didn't want to name, because naming turns fear into a person, and persons can break your life in ways ritual never dreamed. If I knew him, what would that knowledge cost us when the distance finally closed? Rowan's hand settled over mine where it strangled the leather, and the pressure was small but deliberate, an anchor disguised as a shared breath. "They'll flood the plain and they'll make it bright so we forget how to see in the dark," he said, and I heard in it not just strategy but a kind of sorrow for a skill a people can lose without knowing the moment it slips, and I wondered which loss he had mourned longer, home, or the instinct to move without light. If I learned his kind of sight, would I still know how to recognize my own reflection when the firelight came back? The horns broke once more into that tight, ruthless cadence, and the torches swelled as if the night itself were filling with a tide of flame, and I felt the horse gather under us to meet a speed he had not yet asked for, and farther out along the crescent I saw the steady-lamped rider lift his arm and let it fall as smoothly as a guillotine. The plain brightened as the riders poured down, light multiplying until the earth looked like a black sea stung by stars, and the realization entered me clean and cold. This was not reaction, this was choreography, and we had just galloped into someone else's dance. Rowan bent low, his words a thread sewn into the wind where only I could wear them. "Hold fast, Marin Ashford," he said, and beneath the command I heard a truth I wasn't ready to hear. Because after tonight they will not be hunting a widow, they'll be hunting a story. And as the torches flooded the plain behind us and ahead of us and to either side until dark itself seemed outnumbered, I felt the world choose a smaller shape around me, and I knew the next time I let go would not be for a feather but for whatever the story demanded from a woman who had refused to die quietly. So when the circle closes, what price will it set for a name that refuses to be spoken as ash? The plain trembled under the weight of pursuit. Every strike of hooves cracked through the night like iron hammers, and the glow of torches swelled across the ridges until the dark itself seemed hunted. The council had awakened its riders, not with words, not with mercy, but with fire, and the thunder of law turned to flesh and speed. I had thought law was silent, ritual, judgment spoken in cold voices, but no. Tonight it chased me on horseback, fierce as any enemy, merciless as winter itself. I clung tighter to the saddle, my arms aching, the leather biting into my palm. Rowan's horse drove forward as if the ground itself belonged to him, each stride eating distance, but no stride was enough. The horns behind us cut sharp notes through the air, not ritual horns now, but hunting call, each one carrying a language older than my grief. I could hear it in their cadence, flank wide, close fast, drive them toward the river. These were not strangers giving chase. They were my kin, my cousins, men whose faces I had known since childhood, and they had chosen not to weep for me but to run me down. The firelight licked across their silhouettes as they crested the ridge, torches flickering in the wind. My stomach sank. I knew some of those riders. Their laughter had once filled my winters. Their voices had carried my husband's beer. Now their eyes searched for me with the sharpness of hawks. Their horses pressed hard against the night. Did they see me as a prisoner dragged by an outlaw, or as a traitor who had chosen her own exile? I swallowed hard, bile burning in my throat. They're not faceless, I whispered, almost to myself. I know them. The words felt like betrayal even as they left my lips, as though speaking their names in my mind was an act of treachery against Rowan's command. Rowan's voice came low, steady, a knife wrapped in smoke. Of course you know them. That's how law works. It doesn't come as a faceless blade. It comes as your cousin, your brother, your blood, because that's the only way it cuts deep enough to hold. His words pierced me harder than the wind. I had wanted to believe law was an idea, an impersonal decree carved into stone, but no law lived in the hands of those I had once trusted. That was why it bound so tightly. That was why it crushed so well. Could I really call this escape when every stride carried me farther from the family that had once been my breath? The land around us rolled into long ridges, each one echoing the cries of the riders behind. The night drummed with pursuit, each ridge sending the sound back in thunderous waves until I could not tell how many chased us. 10, 20, 50. Their voices blended into the cries of wolves, the call of drums that had not been struck, but that I swore I heard in the back of my skull. My mind fractured between two truths. I was running for my life, and I was betraying every bond I had ever sworn. Rowan pulled the reins, guiding the horse along a narrow cutbank where shadows pooled thick. His body pressed firm against mine, his balance steady even as the ground slanted treacherously beneath us. "Listen," he said, his words rough but certain. "They'll call this betrayal, yes. But what they won't say aloud is that half of them envy you. Half of them wish they had a chance to burn the feather before it buried them too. The law isn't only honor, it's hunger too. And hunger bites hardest when it watches someone else eat first." I wanted to argue, but the thought lodged itself in me like a thorn. I remembered faces from the circle eyes that had looked not mournful, not pitying, but yearning. How many widows had bowed and broken because they feared to run? How many riders tonight chased me not out of loyalty to the law, but because they despised me for daring to leave what they could not? The horse strained as the ground tilted downward, frost snapping under its hooves. My heart thudded with each stumble, my breath ragged with the cold. I clenched the leather so hard my fingers ached. "If I keep riding," I muttered, voice cracked and half swallowed by the wind. "Do I betray them, or do I betray myself if I turn back?" Rowan did not answer immediately. His silence stretched long enough that the horns behind us seemed to fill it, long enough that I thought he would ignore me. But then he leaned low, his breath close against my ear. "That's the only question worth asking. But the truth is, You don't get to answer it tonight. The ice will answer it for you. Ice. I lifted my gaze and saw it. The moonlight shone pale and merciless across the plain, and there, stretched wide like a silver blade, was the river. From a distance it looked solid, white and gleaming, but even I could see the places where black water pooled beneath the skin, where cracks spidered out into the dark. My throat tightened. If the horse struck the wrong seam, we would plunge through. Cold water would swallow us, the current dragging us beneath before the riders even reached the bank. Rowan urged the horse faster, not slower. My body stiffened, panic clawing up my chest. No, Rowan, it won't hold. His jaw was set, his eyes locked forward. It has to. The horns blared again, closer now, the riders pouring across the ridge behind us. Torches spilled fire into the night, the glow trembling across the frost like heat against glass. The horse thundered toward the river, breath steaming, muscles bunching beneath us with desperate power. The sound of pursuit swelled, the cries of men who carried my blood and yet carried fire against me. The law did not speak. It thundered, and it thundered in voices I had once trusted. My pulse hammered, my chest heaved, and ahead, the frozen river stretched like judgment waiting to break. The horse struck the first edge of the ice, hooves ringing sharp against it. For a moment, the surface held, glittering like glass under the moon, and then like breath escaping a wound it cracked. The sound screamed through the night, a shriek of water and breaking skin, and as the ice groaned beneath us, I saw something else, dark shapes moving on the far bank, footprints fresh in the snow. Someone was already waiting. The horse struck the first stretch of ice with a ringing crack that jolted through my bone. For one fragile moment the surface held, gleaming silver in the moonlight as though carved from steel. Then came the sound, the long, tearing shriek of something ancient giving way, the skin of the river splitting open beneath us. It was not a sound of ice breaking. It was a sound of judgment, of the earth itself deciding what lives it would take. The horse lunged forward, its hooves scattering shards that glistened like broken glass across the frozen sheet. My body clenched, breath stuck in my throat, eyes wide as black water flashed through the cracks. The river groaned, its voice deep and merciless, warning us that one misstep would end us. My heart pounded so violently, it drowned out the horns, still calling from the ridge behind. For an instant I thought, better the council's fire than the river's mouth. Could I survive this crossing, or was I riding into a grave dug not by men, but by winter itself? Rowan bent low, his body pressed tight against mine, his voice sharp and urgent in my ear. Don't fight him, let him run. Trust his weight, not yours. His words lashed like a whip, but my limbs refused obedience. Every instinct screamed to grip tighter, to make myself smaller. Yet the horse surged forward with a will older than mine, his instincts tuned not to fear but to survival. Why did Rowan trust the animal's judgment more than my own? The first slab shifted under us, tilting, and water splashed through a jagged seam. My stomach dropped. The cold scent of river struck my nose, raw and metallic. The horse screamed, a high, terrified sound, and my hands dug into the leather as if it could hold me above drowning. I wanted to close my eyes, to bury my face, but something inside me refused. If I died here, I would not die blind. Was this bravery, or simply despair refusing to bow? The second crack came louder, a thunderclap beneath our hooves. The surface gave way, the horse's front leg plunging into water so black it seemed to swallow moonlight. The animal flailed, jerking sideways, and my body pitched forward against Rowan's chest. The shock of cold spray slapped across my face, biting through wool and flesh. My cry broke loose, ripped away by the wind. Was this the moment? Was this how freedom ended beneath a skin of ice I had been foolish enough to trust? Rowan roared above the chaos, his voice raw with command. He wrenched the reins hard, shifting his weight back, forcing the horse to rear and strike for firmer ground. My vision blurred with tears and cold, and I felt the saddle slip beneath me as the beast kicked free. For one awful heartbeat I was weightless, my body sliding sideways toward the river's mouth. The sound of cracking ice swallowed me whole. Then his arm closed around my waist. Rowan yanked me upright with a strength born not of calm, but of fury. His hand clamped me back against him, locking me against the saddle as the horse lunged forward again, hooves hammering, striking, searching for solid footing. His voice tore through the night. "Hold on, Marin. Don't let go." And for the first time since my husband's death, I realized I didn't want to. I didn't want to let go. I didn't want to sink into silence, to vanish beneath a river that would carry my name away in the current. The thought hit me with the violence of the cracking ice. I wanted to live, not just breathe. The horse stumbled again, nearly dropping, and Rowan threw his weight forward, urging the beast with his own body. The river's surface fractured beneath us, but by some miracle, each break led to another slab strong enough to hold. The sound was deafening, ice splitting, water surging through seams, hooves drumming desperate rhythms. The smell of wet leather, horse sweat, and cold river filled my lungs until I thought I might choke. Every breath was pain, but every breath was still life. Was survival always meant to feel like drowning? At last, the horse found a stretch that held steady, the cracks lessening, the ground firmer beneath. My vision swam as Rowan drove the animal onward, one stride, then another, each step carrying us closer to the far bank. The groaning river gave way to silence, then to the sharp crunch of hooves on snow-covered earth. We had crossed. I slumped against him, my chest heaving, lungs clawing for air. My fingers trembled so badly I nearly lost the reins. Rowan's grip steadied me, his arm a band of iron keeping me from collapse. His voice was hoarse, ragged with breath. "You see now?" he muttered, not a question, but an accusation. "Chains kill quieter than rivers, but they kill just the same." His words struck deep. He was right. Death by law, or death by river, both were graves. But here, on the far bank, heart still beating, lungs still burning, I realized a truth I had not dared admit before. I did not want to die bound by silence. The horse slowed, sides heaving, steam rising from its body like ghosts into the night. The river stretched behind us, cracked and broken, a silver wound across the earth. Torches burned on the far ridge where the riders reined in, hesitant to follow. Their shouts carried faint but furious. The law had been delayed, but not denied, for now we had stolen time. But how long could time be stolen before it demanded its debt? Rowan urged the horse into the tree line, seeking cover among the pines. Snow crunched under hooves, muffled by needles. The wind cut sharper here, carrying scents of resin and frost. I shivered, teeth clenching, soaked through to the bone. Rowan's voice softened, just slightly. "Keep breathing. That's the only command you answer tonight." His hand lingered at my side, not as claim, but as anchor, and I wondered, was he holding me steady, or was I holding him from letting go? Then I saw them, footprints, pressed deep into the snow at the base of the trees, not scattered, not hurried, but deliberate, too fresh to be forgotten, too many to be dismissed. The tracks led from the tree line down toward the bank, pausing at the place where we had crossed. Someone had been here, waiting, someone who had watched. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. Rowan reined in sharply, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the dark. He said nothing, but his silence carried weight heavier than words. Whoever left those tracks knew we would come this way. They had not chased, they had waited, and in that realization, a deeper terror gripped me. The council's pursuit was only half the danger. The river had not just tested our survival, it had delivered us into someone else's hands. The horse stamped nervously, breath pluming white in the dark. I stared at the trail of footprints disappearing into the trees, my heart thudding in time with the echoes of cracking ice still ringing in my skull. "Rowan," I whispered, my voice shaking. "They knew we'd come here." His hand tightened on the prive rein. He did not deny it, and as the forest swallowed us, the truth pressed colder than the river. We were not running into freedom. We were running into a trap already waiting for us. The forest swallowed the river's shriek until only our breath remained, white and ragged in the pine. And for the first time since the stones, I heard my own name inside my skull instead of the council's verdict echoing there. Marin, not widow, not shadow, just the syllable, my mother whispered when stormlight rattled the shutters. A name that remembered me before law did. Yet what good is a name if the night is already busy erasing it? Rowan slid from the saddle with a stiffness that told me how hard the river had bitten, then reached up and eased me down so carefully it felt like he feared I might shatter, and when my boots met the snow, my legs trembled as if I were still moving, as if the ground were something I needed permission to trust, which is a foolish way to stand, and yet the only way I knew how to stand, now that ice had taught me its grammar. So how could I pretend I hadn't learned a new language of breaking? He led the horse into a cradle of firs where the branches knitted low, fingers of shadow interlaced to hold our heat, and with his knife he found dry heartwood inside a fallen limb, shaving curls as pale as breath from the grain, laying them in a small, tight nest that could take fire without shouting its birth to the riders beyond. Even his preparations were quiet, the work of someone who expected his life to depend on flame that didn't brag, and I wondered how many nights he had made a home out of corners the day had forgotten, and whether his body knew more of edges than thresholds now. When the spark caught and a thumb of fire licked up, he cupped his hands to shelter it, feeding slivers until it laid down a low, steady glow, not a blaze but a heartbeat we could borrow, and he gestured me closer with a tilt of his chin, not presuming to claim my nearness, but allowing it if I chose, which shouldn't have felt like kindness and yet did. So I knelt and let the heat find my palms, while the cold decided what part of me it would keep as collateral, because the night always takes a price even when you think you've already paid. He watched me for a long breath, then said, "I know the name they used for you at the stones," and left the words there as if they were a knife I could pick up or leave where it gleamed. And the first name that reached my mouth wasn't the one the council would have spoken if it had spoken to me at all. It was the one my husband used when he needed to remind me I belonged in the world, and not just to it. "Marin Ashford," I said, and my voice surprised me by coming whole instead of frayed, as if some thread I hadn't seen had held through the river's teeth. Yet who was I claiming to be if the council had already written a different noun beside me? "You kept that," Rowan said, not smiling, not approving, merely taking the measure of a fact, and I felt the space between us alter, a degree of temperature more than a step, and he nodded toward the fire as if he'd read my pulse there. "Tell me the part of your life the fire won't lie about," he said, and the words cut gentler than they might have, so I let them. I told him about a man whose hands smelled like rope and rye, whose laugh knew exactly how much of a roof a room needed and not a board more, and who came home one winter with sleet burning his cheeks and pressed a wooden feather into my palm and said, "For when the world tries to tell you you're finished," and I remembered the way he taught me to hear the difference between a storm building and a storm leaving, which had seemed like nothing then and now felt like the only math worth learning, and I said his name even soft enough for the needles to keep it, because I didn't trust the open air with it. And isn't that what grief is? The way your voice changes, temperature when it touches certain syllables? Rowan fed another splinter to the fire and asked nothing for a time, which felt like the first true mercy I'd been given since the beer rope slipped from the hands of the men who loved him. And then he said, he carved the feather, not as a question but because he'd heard the shape of the story sit down inside my throat, and I nodded because it was easier than saying yes, and he let the knowledge rest between us like a small, living thing we didn't have to name until it asked us to. Wind threaded through the furs, a note low enough to sound like men thinking, and Rowan tilted his head as if answering a voice outside ours, before he finally spoke a truth that had been walking beside us all night, whether I liked it or not. "Some of the riders behind us are mine," he said, and I felt the ground shift in a way that had nothing to do with thaw and everything to do with family. And for a second I hated the kindness he'd shown me because it made me want forgiveness I hadn't decided to give. So how many loyalties can a single body carry without learning to split? "Kin?" I asked, the word like a burr in my mouth, and he nodded once, eyes not on me but on the horse, as he loosened the girth to ease the animal's ribs. fingers deft and slow the way you move when you're calming something that might bolt. Blood and the kind that thinks it's blood, he said. And even in that odd little twist I heard the map of his life, the circles he had been allowed to enter and the lines he had been asked to cross. And if kin stood across the river as our hunters, what did that make Rowan to them besides a ledger they were sick of paying? Will they hesitate? I asked, because asking is a way to feel less like prey even when you remain prey. And he shook his head with no malice in it, only a fatigue that seemed to sit down in his bones and look around as if it had been traveling a long time. Hesitation is a story told by people who don't have to live with the chapter after it, he said, and the sentence rearranged something in me I'd been pretending was nailed down. Because wasn't that what the council asked of me, to hesitate forever, to be a pause shaped like a person? We ate nothing, because hunger would have made noise in our bellies, and drank little, because thirst makes you clumsy when you try to outrun it with water. And after a while Rowan rose to scout the trees, leaving me with the horse and the small, obedient flame, and the animal turned its head and breathed into my hair like a reassurance it didn't owe me, which made me want to cry and then made me angry for wanting that, because how many comforts do we accept simply because they kneel to be accepted? He moved quiet as smoke among the trunks, and I followed his path more with skin than sight, the way a room knows who's inside it without counting, when a dark thread in the branches caught my eye, something that didn't belong to bark or shadow, a small length of leather tied in a clean, deliberate knot around a low limb, as if to place a thought where the wind could read it. I stood, pulse ticking, and reached for it, like you reach for something that might bite if you try to be quick. And when I tugged the knot loose, a carving dropped into my hand, warm from where the leather had held it, and my breath went out of me in a sound that was part laugh and part wound. A feather, not any feather, his feather, Evan's work, the angle of the barb so precise they made your thumb expect a slickness that wasn't there, the curve cut with that little hitch he had when he overthought perfection and then apologized for it with patience. And my eyes blurred so fast the thing doubled and the branch became a pair of branches, and there in the duplicate I felt the river again, the cold, the crack, the way the world keeps making versions of itself, to see if you'll notice which one is trying to keep you. Who had tied this here where I, not Rowan, would see it first? Rowan appeared at my shoulder so quietly I flinched, and he caught my wrist not hard, just steady, guiding my palm open to study the carving by the fire's hush. He didn't reach for it as if it were his clue to take. He looked at it the way you look at a face in a crowd when it finally turns toward you. Not chance, he said, the words soft and unsatisfied, and not sympathy. And I wanted to tell him he didn't get to edit kindness out of the world simply because he'd learned to live without it. But before I could, the greater truth that sat inside my own chest spoke. This was a road sign written in grief, and I was not the one who'd written it tonight. Guided or hunted? I asked. The two doors presented like rival altars, and Rowan's mouth tightened into the sort of line men get when they refuse to offer you a lie simply because you asked for a softer pillow. Both, he said, as if the world had grown too small for the luxury of a single answer, and I had the sudden, sick sensation that the circle at the stones had never ended. It had only widened until the pines could fit inside it, which meant who was sitting beyond the trees taking the vote now. He tied the carving back where I'd found it, a deliberate reversal that said, "I see you seeing me," and then he snuffed our small fire with a pinch of snow and ash, leaving the warmth to thread itself back into the earth in the way heat knows how to leave without complaint. And we stood listening to a silence that didn't sound empty so much as waiting, which is the most dangerous kind, because at least hunger announces itself while waiting learns your name first. "Say his name again," Rowan said in the dark, and though it startled me, I understood. Some names are lanterns you carry. They don't always show you the road, but they make the road admit it exists. And I said, "Evan," and the night changed shape around it, the way a sheet changes when a body lies down under it, and he nodded once, as if the sound had struck a map he'd been memorizing, which made me want to snatch the name back and hide it, Because who gets to keep what when the story starts using your belongings as landmarks? We moved deeper into the firs, leading the horse on foot to spare him the weight until the ground forgot we'd crossed the river and began pretending it was only forest. And for a time there was no sound but our boots worrying the crust of snow and the low creak of leather answering our steps. And then a thread of noise came from the far slope, not the horn, not the clatter of a careless rider, but a long, patient howl that lifted the hair on my arms before I could tell myself it was only a wolf testing the night. How does a voice turn meat into map with nothing but breath? The howl curved off into a hush, and in that hush another sound unfolded, 3 notes and a pause, not sung but whistled through teeth, the kind of human signal that doesn't need words because it has practiced not needing them. And every part of me that had learned to hear storms said, that was not for us, which is the only reason it terrified me as much as it did, because messages that aren't for you are the ones that have already counted you. Rowan's hand lifted, palm back, the soldier's hush. I didn't need him to teach because my bones already knew it, and we froze with the horse between us while the whistle came again, farther off and then closer, trading places with the wolf's voice like partners that had agreed on steps. And I realized I could no longer tell which one moved first, animal or man, so what do you call a hunt when it sins in 2 languages at once? The last note fell and stayed fallen, and the quiet that followed wasn't peace so much as a held breath that belonged to something bigger than either of us. And Rowan leaned close enough that his words brushed the rim of my ear. "They're not chasing," he said, and I felt the river inside me a second time without water. "They're herding," and as the wind turned and carried our heat a few inches into the trees, I knew the ridge fire we had yet to see would not be a question but a sentence, so when the light finally rose, would it be a signal or a snare? We smelled the smoke before we saw the light, a thin, ashy thread weaving through the firs, whispering of pitch and green needles sacrificed in a hurry, the kind of fuel you use when you don't mind being found or you very much want it. And Rowan stopped so suddenly the horse bumped his shoulder with a puzzled snort, because even animals understand when flame speaks a dialect meant for ears rather than hands. So which language was this fire practicing on us? We crested a low saddle and the ridge shouldered up in front of us, its back lined with black shapes that could have been stones until the wind leaned and the orange breathed brighter, revealing a single flame settled in a cleared ring like a coin on a gambler's palm, bright and lonely and exactly the size of a decision. And I felt my throat tighten because no one builds a perfect circle for warmth when the night is running. They build it to be seen, which begs the only question worth asking. By whom? Rowan crouched with the patience of a man who has lived long enough to regret unnecessary questions, eyes measuring the wind and the lay of the brush, counting in his head all the ways light travels when you want it to lie. And after a long silence he said, "We ignore it, and we prove we're clever. We answer it, and we prove we're desperate." And I hated how the sentence boxed us into a corner that didn't have a door, because isn't that the trick snare makers love, the one where pride and need both step on the same spring? "Light one of our own," I said before I had time to be afraid of hearing myself suggest it, and Rowan slanted me a look that held both caution and a flicker of respect, as if he'd been waiting to see whether I'd speak like cargo or like company. And I pointed to a shallow bowl of snow tucked in a stand of stunted pine. "There," I said, heart throwing itself forward faster than my tongue. "We build a decoy in the dish and feed it with green so it smokes like grief. Then we leave it and circle right. If they read us as moths, they'll wait at the edge for our wings." And as soon as I finished the plan, I heard how arrogant it sounded to hope your hunters would behave as predictably as insects. Yet what else is strategy but the loudest prayer you can afford? He nodded once, already scanning for fuel that would sting the air without screaming light, and together we collected handfuls of sap-heavy twigs and a twist of resin from a scored scar, working without striking more than the smallest spark, a tinder so stingy it felt like we were stealing a secret instead of making one. And when the smoke finally threaded upward from our cup of snow, It wore the same blue-green sorrow as the ridge flame, which told me we had matched a language I didn't want to be fluent in. So what kind of person learns to speak imitation in a night like this? We left the horse ground-tied with a loop he could defeat if terror demanded it, and moved low across the slope, our backs pressed to weather-gnarled trunks, the ridge fire intermittently vanishing and returning as the land made its own choices about what we should see and when, and the wind fussed with the smoke until it drifted exactly where I didn't want it down, and toward our shallow draw, an accidental betrayal or a useful nudge, I couldn't tell, and I felt the first cold pearl of sweat work between my shoulder blades, because once smoke chooses you, it introduces you to everything else that likes to follow. Rowan touched 2 fingers to his lips and then pointed far left, a darker blot among the darker trees, a watcher where no watch should be if this were kindness, the kind of stillness that moves once every 5 minutes to keep its blood honest. And I knew then the ridge's coin was an invitation to a game whose rules had been rehearsed, which meant we weren't the only ones circling. So whose memory were we dancing inside if not our own? Let them read the smoke, I breathed, knowing breath itself can be treason when it carries heat, and we slid right, boots soft in the crust, moving along a deer path that had decided not to be a road tonight, while our decoy exhaled its grief behind us. And though the ridge flame never brightened, it never died either, a patience that made my teeth ache, because patience has a way of peeling truth off you in strips. And I realized the fire didn't need to shout to be heard. It needed only to wait for our curiosity to write its name in the snow. Halfway along the contour, Rowan stopped and listened the way a hunter listens to the space between sound, and the hair on my arms rose before I understood why. Hoofbeats, split and coming from 2 angles. Not the river toward rush of a single line, but the careful, teeth-bared approach of pincers. One group letting their horses rock slow so the stirrup leather wouldn't sing, the other pushing quick to force a choice, and my mouth dried so completely I could feel my tongue stick to the word trap before I said it. So why say it at all if the night was already fluent? Your plan bought us a minute, Rowan said, not as flattery but as accounting. Now we'll spend it. And he pointed to a scatter of deadfall that made a jagged funnel between 2 ice-buckled hummocks. Through the teeth, he said, then turn the wind, and when he saw my confusion, he gave the ghost of a smile that didn't reach anything except duty. We'll ride straight at the left flank and make them think we're breaking stupid. When they surge to swallow us, we use the smoke to slip across their rear, and if that fails, we climb. And he tipped his chin to a spine of rock that promised a goat's path to anyone who loved thin air more than certainty. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but questions make echoes, and echoes bring company, so I settled for the one that mattered most to the part of my life that still counted the living. If the left is led by someone who knows you, I said, will he leave the mouth of the trap open or close it on purpose to prove a point? And Rowan's eyes flicked, sharp and almost tender, the way a doctor looks at a wound he can't promise to cure. He'll close it, he said. And in the clean pain of that answer I learned something about love I hadn't wanted. Sometimes it proves itself by the speed with which it harms. We ran for the deadfall, ducking and threading the shattered limbs while the hoofbeats braided behind us. And when we burst through the last snarl into a small clearing, the wind chose that exact moment to roll our decoy smoke downhill in a fat, undeniable ribbon, painting the snow with a bruise of scent that said here, here, here. And for a heartbeat, I hated the air for having such opinion. So what do you threaten when you can't threaten the sky? Mount, Rowan said, his voice neither loud nor soft, just the sound iron makes when it knows the shape of the forge. And I was in the saddle before the horse could decide whether to object, my legs remembering the fear and the relief both from the river, 2 anxieties that canceled each other until only motion remained. And Rowan swung up behind me with that same efficient grace that made room for nothing ornamental, his hands gathering reins and my waist in the same motion like a man who didn't want to carry but knew how to, and the horse surged at his knees as if he resented the delay more than the danger. We burst from the little bowl of snow and cut toward the left flank, as he'd said, and the watchers there, expecting a fox to duck, straightened in surprise as the fox bared its throat and ran at their lanterns, and for 5 beautiful, terrifying seconds, confusion made our road. Then the leader snapped his arm and the line compressed to swallow us. Exact, drilled, merciless. Only the smoke slid across their faces then, a green-blue ribbon, thick enough to sting eyes that thought they'd seen everything, and we knifed along the seam of their momentary blindness like a word too small to read until it's already been read, which is either genius or luck. And how often are we allowed to pretend we can tell the difference? One rider broke free of the sting first, and his shout carried a cadence I recognized even without the words, a name stretched in a way only kin can stretch it, and the horse under him tore forward with that awful enthusiasm only righteous certainty possesses, and somewhere in my body I knew the syllables without hearing them, because recognition doesn't always need ears, and I wanted to look back, but Rowan's hand came up and steadied my chin toward the rocks, not unkindly, only in insistence, and I realized that looking back would cost us what little the wind was offering. We climbed the first stretch of stone, hooves sparking on hidden flint, the horse belling air with his nostrils as he sought purchase where goats would hesitate, and the 2 lines of hoofbeats fanned out below, one angling to pinch our climb, the other racing to get above for the strike downhead. And in that geometry I read minds I didn't want to, strategies laid like snares across childhood trails, and the ridge flame burned on, indifferent, a coin that refused to be spent. So whose hand had tossed it onto the table in the first place, if not the council? At the last shelf before the spine narrowed, the wind tumbled the smoke back toward us in a sudden backhand that made my eyes water, and the horse toss his head, and for a half-breath I thought the air had finally decided to endorse the rider's petition, and then the split. Happened, the sound I dreaded and expected, hoofbeats cleaving as the pursuers divided to take both mouths of the pass. One line to our left, one to our right, a pincer rewired for stone instead of grass, and the echo wrote the shape of it on the rock so even the dead could have read it if they'd cared to, which means we had earned exactly what we'd bought, a choice with teeth. Rowan leaned to my ear without stealing a glance from the path and said, "Hold your breath now, and when I tell you, let it go." A command that made no sense until I realized he was measuring not air, but fear, and that he needed mine to be smaller than the horse's for 3 heartbeats, which felt like a riddle I had no time to solve. So I gathered my lungs like fabric in a fire and prepared to burn them on command, because what else is courage but the willingness to mistime your breath? Below, the split hoofbeats drew even with us on both sides, close enough that I could make out bits of talk through the jingle, the click-swear of a man schooling his mount, the brief prayer of another speaking to a mother or a saint, the word Rowan bitten in half by a third as if the mouth had learned to fear the whole and above. The ridge brightened with a new lick of flame as if the coin had been turned by a finger we couldn't see, and I understood we had crossed from running to being arraigned, which is a worse verb in every language I know. "Now," Rowan said, and I emptied my lungs as he drove the horse across the spine with a sidelong step that risked everything on a ledge the width of a lie, and for a breath the world held, and for another it didn't, because holding and breaking often take turns without warning, and in the violent silence that followed, the 2 lines of hoofbeats collided with our absence, as if we had always been where we suddenly weren't. So when the mountain finishes laughing, which direction will it throw the echo back? We camped in a hollow cut by wind and stone, where the earth folded in on itself like a scar. Rowan led the horse into the lee of a rock outcrop, and I dropped beside the fire he coaxed into being small, careful, no more light than a glowworm's eye. My body ached from the climb, from the river's wounds still clinging to my skin. But it was not fatigue that gnawed me most. It was the weight of something I had carried long before tonight, something no river could wash off. What bound me was not rope, not chain, not even the law chasing us on horseback. It was the vow I had whispered to the grave of the man I had loved, a vow tied into the feather I had dropped at the council stones. They believed it marked the end of my mourning. They were wrong. That feather was not a ritual. It was a promise. Rowan crouched across the fire from me, the glow cutting his features into planes of shadow and bone. He studied me not with suspicion, but with the watchfulness of a man waiting for a crack in stone. "I didn't tell you," I whispered, voice hoarse from cold and fear. "The feather I dropped, it wasn't just mourning. It was my oath. I swore I would carry it until I could lay it on Evan's grave myself, not at the stones, not at the council's command, but at the earth that held him. That was the vow I made." Rowan's eyes flickered, catching the firelight like flint. "And yet you dropped it." The words cut sharper than any blade. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering not from the cold but from shame. They forced me. The law forced me. I let go of the feather, but I did not let go of him. Not really. And now, my voice broke, splintering like the ice beneath us. "Now I've broken the only promise that mattered." For a long time, Rowan said nothing. Only the horse shifted behind us, breath rising in slow white plumes. I thought he would mock me for weakness, or worse, turn his back. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a ragged edge that made me look up. "You're not the only one who broke an oath." He leaned back against the stone, eyes lifted toward the stars as though they were witnesses he both hated and needed. His voice came low, each word shaped by memory heavy as iron. "I swore to my brother I would never leave his side. We were blood and breath, fighting together, eating together, carrying each other through winters so lean the snow seemed to eat us first. I swore I would never abandon him, not even if the council demanded it." His jaw tightened, the fire catching the muscles in his face like a blade drawn taut. "And then one night, I left. I chose the oath I had made to my own heart instead, and I have been paying for that choice every day since." I swallowed, my throat dry as frost. "Your brother, he's among them, isn't he? The riders who chase us." Rowan's silence was answer enough. The fire cracked softly, sending a thread of smoke into the night. For a moment, all I could hear was the wind sighing through the pine and the low beat of my heart against my ribs. I wanted to ask why he had left, what vow had outweighed blood, but the question lodged in my throat. Some truths were not ready to be dragged into the firelight. Instead, I whispered, "So we're the same, both of us haunted by oaths we broke." His eyes lowered to meet mine, and for the first time since the stones I saw something unarmored in his gaze. Not pity, not calculation, something rawer. "The same," he said softly. The words settled between us like a second fire, small but dangerous, carrying heat that could burn or warm depending on how close we dared draw. I turned my featherless hands over the flames, and I realized something I had not dared admit before. I trusted him, not because he promised safety he hadn't, not because he had saved me from drowning though he had, but because he carried the same scars, 2 lives bound by oaths we could never unmake, and undone by the breaking of them. We sat in silence, not needing to fill it, the fire breathing low, the forest pressing close. But silence, like law, never stays empty for long. At first it was faint, so faint I thought it was only the wind shifting. Then it grew low, steady, carrying through the trees with a rhythm no storm could match. The beat of drums. I froze. The sound rolled over the hills, deep and resonant, a call older than words. Rowan stiffened too, his head tilting, listening. The horse stamped nervously, snorting, its breath quickening. Drum, not hunting horns now, not pursuit. This was heavier, slower. Judgment's rhythm, the council calling across distance, calling not to chase, but to summon. Rowan's voice broke the hush, low and grim. "They're gathering. Dawn will not wait." I clutched my cloak tighter, the sound of drums crawling beneath my skin. Judgment was coming, not tonight, not in whispers or hoofbeats, but in the cold light of dawn, when oaths and betrayals would be dragged into the open. The fire flickered low, the drums throbbed louder, and my chest hollowed with dread. What would dawn demand of me, of Rowan, of the broken promises that bound us both? The drums carried through the night, echoing against the ridges until it felt like the earth itself was beating time toward our trial. And just as the sound faded into the distance, another voice rose, the long, low howl of a wolf, answered by the sharp whistle of a man. Not one, not the other, both. And in that mingling, I knew Dawn's judgment would not wait for the council alone. Something wild had already found us. The fire had long since collapsed to embers when I saw them. At first they were only sparks in the black, a trick of my tired eyes, I thought, a reflection of coals against low branches. But the longer I stared, the clearer they became. Eyes, pairs of them, moving, weaving between the trees, low to the ground. Too many, too steady. Wolves. The night exhaled, and the smell hit me: musk, blood, winter fur soaked with the iron of old kills. My breath hitched, and my hand flew to Rowan's arm. He was already awake. His head had lifted the instant the howl and whistle tangled in the distance. Now his hand slid slow to his knife, his eyes fixed on the dark. "They've found us," he whispered. The horse snorted and stamped, pulling against the tether. Ears pricked forward. The air thickened with tension, the kind that doesn't just press on your skin but seeps into your bone, whispering, "Run, run, run." But there was nowhere to run. The wolves had already drawn their circle. The first shape slipped from the tree line, silent as shadow. Then another. Their fur was black, gray, silver where the moon touched it, their teeth white against the dark. The pack fanned out, hemming us in tighter with each step. I clutched Rowan's sleeve. Are they hunting us or hurting us? His eyes didn't leave the glow. Does it matter? The wolves lowered their heads, their bodies long and fluid, tails low but not tucked, confident. This was no accident. They had chosen us. The largest of them padded forward, a scar across its muzzle glinting like a pale slash under the moon. Its growl vibrated through the ground beneath my knees, a sound not made to frighten, but to promise. My chest constricted. Rowan shifted his stance, knife steady. "Stay behind me." But even as he said it, the truth settled heavy in my gut. There was no behind, not anymore. If the wolves broke, they would come from every side. The circle would collapse, and I would either stand or be dragged down. My hands trembled. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might draw them faster. And then, through the pounding, a thought surfaced, cold and sharp as the river's bite. I didn't want to die, not here, not like this, not on the edge of exile without finishing what I had promised. The scar-muzzled wolf sprang. Its body was a shadow streaking through firelight, teeth bared, eyes burning. Rowan moved to meet it, but instinct drove me faster. My hand closed on a length of firewood from the ember, its tip glowing faint red. I swung with every ounce of terror in me, and the log cracked against the beast's shoulder with a sound that split my ears. It yelped, twisting mid-air, crashing into the dirt with a snarl. The impact jolted through me, shaking me to my bone. My arms quivered, but I raised the makeshift weapon again, teeth clenched, breath ragged. For the first time since Evan's burial, I had struck to live. Another wolf lunged from the left. Rowan's knife flashed, catching the light for a heartbeat before sinking into fur. The beast tumbled back, snarling. The ground sprayed with sparks as its body slid across coals. Rowan pivoted, his face calm in the chaos. Each movement measured, practiced. I was not practiced. I was raw fear, raw will, raw need. But in that moment, fear became fuel. Another wolf crept low toward me, teeth catching the light. I forced myself forward, jabbing the burning wood, the heat licking its muzzle. It snapped, teeth closing inches from my arm. I screamed not in fear, but in fury, and thrust harder. The smell of singed fur filled the night. The wolf yelped and skittered back into the dark. Rowan's voice cut through the chaos. "That's it, Marin. Don't retreat. Make them doubt you." Doubt? Could wolves doubt? Could predators hesitate? The scarred leader circled, growling, its pack answering in a Morse chorus of snarl. Their eyes wove closer again, the circle tightening. The fire burned low, the embers spitting weak sparks. My weapon dimmed with each swing. My arms shook with exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, In the space between breaths, truth clawed its way out. The feather had never been meant for the council, never meant for their stone, their fire, their law. It had been Evan's, a carving pressed into my hand with love, not law, a vow whispered to his grave, not to the elders. I had broken it when I dropped it at the stones, and tonight fighting here, clawing for breath, I knew I could never forgive myself if I died without carrying it back to him. I never meant to give it to them. I cried into the night, voice cracking. It was for him, only him, not for their judgment, not for their fire. The words burst from me like blood from a wound. The wolves growled louder, as if feeding on my confession. But Rowan froze, his knife poised, his eyes snapping toward me. For the first time since I met him, he faltered not in body, but in silence. He had heard more in my words than I had meant to reveal. The scar-muzzled wolf lunged again. Rowan moved faster this time, intercepting with brutal precision. His blade caught the beast across its side, sending it skidding away, whining into the trees. The pack hesitated. One by one, they backed, growling low, their glowing eyes retreating into shadow. The circle broke, my knees buckled, the firewood slipping from my hand. My chest heaved, every breath raw, every muscle screaming. Rowan wiped his knife clean against the snow, his face unreadable. I waited for words. None came. Instead, he looked at me not the way a man looks at someone who fought beside him, but the way a man looks when he hears a truth too heavy to carry lightly. His silence weighed heavier than the wolf's eyes. The night fell quiet again, too quiet, and then movement, beyond the tree line, just past where the wolves had vanished. Shadows shifted, not four-legged, taller, human, torches faint in the distance, their light bleeding against the bark. Riders, they had been waiting, watching, letting the wolves do their work before stepping in to finish it. The wolves had not been the only predators circling us tonight. The fire guttered, smoke stinging my eyes as I stumbled back against the stone. Rowan stepped forward, knife still in hand, his body taut with the knowledge of what approached. Not wolves, he said quietly, his voice like flint striking steel. Not anymore. The shadows thickened, torches swayed, and as the riders advanced beyond the tree line, I felt the truth settle like frost in my chest. The hunt was far from over. It had only just changed its teeth. The riders at the tree line did not charge. They arranged themselves like a thought deciding whether to speak, the torches lifting and lowering with a patience that made the hair along my neck lift as well. And Rowan's knife never quite returned to its sheath as he eased the horse backward into the trees, because men who wait that long to move have already measured you. So what number had they written beside my name? We slipped the tether and I swung into the saddle before the animal had finished turning, the motion clean, owned, not borrowed, and the realization struck me like a small bell inside the ribs that I had mounted without being lifted, without thinking of falling, without asking the knight's permission. So whose reins had I been holding all this time if not my own? Rowan stepped into the stirrup and came up behind me with the same spare efficiency that had become its own language between us, his hands finding the reins while mine stayed there, layered over his, and neither of us corrected the overlap, because speed forgives grammar when the sentence is escape. Yet something in me refused to yield the leather entirely, which begged the question, at what point does survival become authorship? Through a scarf of fog gathered low in a hollow, the horse's breath stitching little ghosts into the air, and beyond it, the forest thinned to a flat of snow-stubbled grass where the wind carried a smell I recognized before I wanted to char, soaked into wood long after flame has left its sermon behind. The sermon that says this is how quickly a home forgets its shape, and I knew we were riding toward history that still smoked even if the smoke had learned to hide. The burned wagon rose ahead like a rib cage, spokes splayed, ash clotted where canvas would once have held the warmth of sleeping bodies, and scattered around it lay the ordinary items that become relics. The instant people leave an iron pot on its side, a toy carved from a branch and smoothed by a child's insistent love, a strap buckled for a beast that would not return to claim it, and my throat closed on the thought that someone had counted bowls and blankets in the dark and decided which memory to let the fire eat first. So which of these ruins would bear my fingerprints if I had chosen differently at the stone? We threaded past the wagon, the horse picking his feet high, and I reached to steady him because the leather under my palms steadied me, and Rowan didn't correct my hand. He let them steer through the blackened bones of other people's choices, as if he had been waiting for mine to remember themselves. And it stung that I needed ruins to claim authority. Yet maybe ashes are the truest teachers because they never pretend not to be aftermath. Another camp lay a half-mile on, livid with silence, shelters taken down in a hurry, poles left like punctuation marks without a sentence, boot prints the wind had sketched at and then lost interest in, and a length of rope trailing from a stump where something once been tethered and then freed or lost. I couldn't tell which, because freedom and loss smell the same on the first night. Which of them had I embraced when I took the whisper into my ear? I tightened the reins as we climbed a short rise, not to slow the horse so much as to feel the answer travel backward into my hands, and Rowan let my motion lead, his weight adjusting behind me to release the animal into my ask, and the ground falling away beyond the crest showed a long, low valley where the snow had taken on that blue-gray of pre-dawn, and every shadow looked like a promise kept badly, and I realized I was no longer counting how to flee but where to make the next decision hold. So when had I stopped being cargo? Take the left line, Rowan murmured, voice calm as a map that has decided not to argue. The right drifts into a blind, and I guided us left, because I wanted the responsibility of being wrong rather than the comfort of being merely carried, and the horse responded as if he'd been waiting for my wrists to speak first, which made me angry at the tenderness of animals and grateful beyond bearing at the same time, because what if the only creature who believed me capable tonight had hooves? The valley's floor bore marks older than the pursuit-deep ruts, where wheels had sunk and frozen, then thawed and hardened again into a crisscrossed ledger of journeys that had not agreed with each other, and the sun never quite got around to reading the whole page in winter, leaving the rest to be interpreted by those who had to pass. We picked our way through careful as a sentence, trying to avoid becoming a cliché, and somewhere behind us the horn called once an economical note, no flourish, no dramatics, which told me the hunt had decided to save its breath for something that mattered more. So what would that be if not our names spoken aloud? We found the next ruin on the far side of the flats, where a copse had been cut back to make room for the idea of permanence, and then regretted it as soon as the idea failed to prove itself. And here the ash wasn't from a single fire, but from a life taught to accept series, cook fire, watch fire, farewell. And I was suddenly and uselessly furious at how quickly human heat becomes residue, which is to say I was furious at mortality and too tired to blame the stars. I slid one hand from the reins and touched the char of a post as we passed, black dust smearing my glove, and the smear felt like a blessing and a mark both, the same way the feather had been both a token and a chain, and I heard Evan's voice, not as memory but as weather. When a storm carries soot, breathe shallow and ride sideways, and I realized that grief had not only taken my husband, it had also taught me to ride different, which meant even my competence owed a debt to loss. How do you pay such a thing without going bankrupt? Look, Rowan said, his chin tipping toward a ridge beyond the valley, and at first I saw only stone and scrub and the endless essay of snow, until the eye adjusted and resolved a line of riders along the crest, not moving, only present, a punctuation mark that changed the meaning of everything beneath it, and at the center of that line a figure without a torch, without any need for additional light, as if the other's flames existed merely to teach the surrounding dark his name, and my chest tightened because that posture wrote command in a script my body already recognized. We angled for cover beneath the ridge, into a shallow draw where the snow lay flawed by the delicate crossing of small animals and the brutal drag of something too heavy to lift, and we followed the heavy trail until it became a story that didn't want to be told. A sled's rut, a pair of boots, then only the boots, then only a depression where someone had sat down and considered not standing again, and I wanted to dismount and lay my palm there as if warmth could reverse time. But the draw had ears, and the ridge had eyes, and my choices were no longer mine to make privately. The ridge riders began to move at last, not down toward us but along, pacing as if across a balcony, reading our progress the way men read a play they've seen enough times to anticipate the scene changes. And Rowan's breath warmed the space beside my ear as he said, "He'll choose the moment that looks least like choosing." And I hated the familiarity in his voice because it meant the one above was family, and family is merely law that knows your secrets. So what secret did he intend to spend on us? We cut back toward the lee of a line of wind-stunted shrubs, and I felt Rowan's hand leave the reins to rest over mine instead of replacing them, a gesture that felt less like guidance and more like partnership, and in that little pressure my spine lengthened, because at last the reins were not a test but a recognition, and I pressed my heels to the horse in a way that said, "I mean it," and he gathered himself and gave us speed, which is the only proof a horse can offer that he believes you. The valley narrowed and became a throat, the sides rising in a soft V that would be a gift or a noose depending on who reached the mouth first, and from behind came the echo play of hooves in snow, 2 lines, then a third, slower, and above us the ridge line's center detached from his row and began a diagonal that was all decision disguised as drift, and I knew even before I knew that this was the moment the story stopped pretending not to know our name. We burst into a small amphitheater formed by a collapsed bank, where spring melt had chewed and not quite finished chewing, and there the wind had piled snow in a curve that would slow any horse too honest to lie about footing, and ours was honest, and slowed, and then the figure from the ridge resolved into a man riding down through the scrub with the economy of someone who had long ago learned which motions matter, and Rowan breathed one word without meaning to. Cassian. The name carried iron filings in it, drawn inexorably toward some unseen magnet, and the sound changed everything, because hearing the brother, his mouth took all the air out of the draw and replaced it with history, and the man coming toward us was cut from the same quarry as Rowan, but finished with a different chisel, broader through the shoulder, jaw set not in caution but in decision, the kind of decision that has been saving and damning people since infancy. And when he reached a distance that allowed recognition to find a face, I saw that his eyes were Rowan's without the exits. He raised a hand, and the riders who had followed him from the ridge slowed as if the gesture had pulled a string inside their chests. And he kept coming, alone now, the horse under him dark and sure, and he let the silence deepen because men like him understand that sound has value, and value should not be squandered. And when he finally spoke, his voice found us as precisely as a thrown loop finds a neck. "Rowan," he said, no accusation yet, but no welcome either, and Rowan's shoulders shifted, not a flinch, not submission, just the body of a man adjusting to carry a weight it knows too well. And I felt the pressure of his hand on mine increase by a fraction because touch is the only currency left when language begins to fail. "You've made them write songs without asking permission," Cassian continued, letting his gaze travel over me and back so swiftly it could have counted as politeness if the air hadn't chilled around us at its passing. "And you've taught them to believe they can step out of the circle and still be invited to the feast. And even though I had no feast and no circle, I felt what it is to be seen as an argument rather than a person, and the argument he wanted to win was older than both of us." Rowan's reply carried the sanded patience of someone who has practiced not striking first. "Go back to the ridge," he said, quiet enough to deny it the dignity of a command. "Tell them to douse their torches and sleep." And Cassian smiled with only a corner of his mouth, the smile of hinge rather than a joy. "You know I can't," he said, and the can't was heavier than any won't, because duty spoken in that tone is not an excuse. It is a vow being cashed. The horse beneath me shifted, and I steadied him before Rowan could, the reins answering my hands with a little forgiveness I wanted to deserve, and Cassian's eyes found the motion and held it a heartbeat longer than was necessary. and the air around us changed shape because I was no longer a rumor mounted behind a troublemaker. I was a decision that had learned to hold leather. So when had my learning become his business? "Give her back," Cassian said to Rowan, and the politeness died in the sentence, even as the grammar held, "and come up to the ridge and answer like a man who remembers his name." And I felt the word give land like a collar, and the impulse rose in me to spit it out onto the snow where even crows would refuse to touch it. But Rowan spoke first, and his voice carried a thread I had not heard before tonight: grief for the living. "She's not a bundle to be returned," he said, and Cassian's jaw flexed because the point had struck somewhere tender. And I saw then that the man on the ridge had not come down tonight because he hated his brother, but because he had decided to love him correctly. And correct love is the kind that breaks bone to set it straight, which means who gets to decide what straight looks like. "Names," Cassian said, as if he were choosing which instrument to play the next note on, "are for Dawn." And the words chose their own directions before they finished leaving his mouth. One toward me, one toward Rowan, and one toward the circle of riders on the ridge who would decide whether Dawn came with talking or with rope. And Rowan's breath warmed my ear just long enough to say ready without syllable, because men who have been brothers learn how to speak even when there are too many witnesses. The amphitheater held quiet the way a bowl holds water, and then the line of riders behind Cassian fanned slightly without advancing, leaving that deliberate aperture that says we can close this whenever we choose, and the restraint itself bared teeth, because controlled mercy is a more dangerous weapon than fury, and the truth sank into my bones that even now they preferred not to spill blood if spectacle would do. So what was I if not a lesson being arranged on a blackboard of snow? Cassian drew his horse 2 steps nearer and let his eyes settle to my level, not to Rowan, because hierarchy is a thing you paint with glances when you want to write conclusions without offering argument. And when he spoke again, the sound found not my ears, but the place in the chest where you keep the name you answer to even when you're alone. "Marin Ashford," he said, tasting each syllable like a scout tastes water for silt, and my back straightened in the saddle not because he commanded it, but because my name prefers to be met standing. And hearing it in his mouth told me what the torchless posture had been telling me all along. He did not merely know of me, he had studied me, which means some part of my life had been read to him as a report. So who held the ledger where my days had been tallied while I wasn't looking? "Ride forward," Cassian said, the words too even to be a request and too well bred to be a threat, "so we can speak about the feather you dropped and the oath you stole." And the snow between us gleamed like a page waiting for ink while the riders on the ridge shifted their torches to make the script legible, and the night asked me the only question it had left in its quiver: "If judgment wants you upright, will you give it your knees?" Chapter 11. Judgment at the Stone. The council stones rose from the earth like the ribs of an ancient beast, pale in the frostlight of dawn. They were just rocks, mute, cold, older than any oath I had spoken. But as Rowan guided the horse into the circle's shadow, my chest clenched as if the stones themselves could see me. The fire pit in their center smoldered faintly, fed by men who had kept the flames alive through the night, as if judgment could not arrive unless fire was waiting to devour it. Cassian rode ahead, posture unbending, his torchless presence casting an authority even brighter than the fire. Behind him, the riders fanned in disciplined arcs, their horses steaming in the cold, their faces unreadable. My own people, cousins, kin, the sons of families who had once braided bread with mine, stood among them, eyes fixed on me, not with pity, not even with anger, but with expectation. They wanted me to kneel, to make this simple. Rowan's hand brushed mine on the reins, his grip steady, as if to ask without words, "Do you want me to turn? Do you want me to fight?" But I already knew the answer. If I must kneel before the stones, I will kneel speaking. I slid down from the saddle before Rowan could move to stop me. The cold stabbed up through my boots, and the circle of riders parted slightly, enough for me to walk forward. Every step cracked frost beneath me, the sound sharp in the silence, my breath fogged in the dawn air. trembling with the weight of the choice I carried. Cassian's gaze followed me, unblinking. "You've returned," he said. His tone was not triumph, not accusation. It was the quiet certainty of a man who knew the story would always end here. I looked at the stones, then at the fire, then at the faces around me. My voice shook, but not from fear, from fury, from grief sharpened into steel. They told me the feather was to mark the end of mourning, to surrender the past, to bow my head and live half a life. But the feather was never theirs to command. It was my husband's, a carving pressed into my palm with love, not law. It was my oath to him, not to you. A ripple moved through the circle, whispers, disbelief, shock. I felt their eyes press harder, as though the stones themselves had leaned closer. Cassian tilted his head slightly. "An oath to the dead has no place among the living." Rowan stepped forward then, his voice low but carrying. "And yet it is the dead who keep us honest. We're all bound by graves, Cassian. You know that better than most." Cassian's eyes flicked toward his brother, hard as flint. "Do not speak of oaths you broke." The air between them tightened. Two men bound by blood, yet divided by a fracture older than tonight. Rowan's hand hovered near his knife. Cassian's horse shifted, restless, sensing its rider's tension. I felt the moment sharpen, the duel not yet drawn but already promised. I forced my voice into the space before steel could speak. "You call me traitor for breaking law, but the law broke me first. It demanded silence when my heart needed to speak. It demanded surrender when my hands still knew how to hold. If I must kneel, I will kneel speaking, and my words will not be yours." I moved to the fire. The embers glowed, weak but hungry, as if waiting to consume whatever was given to them. I reached into my cloak and drew out the carving Rowan had tied back at the furs, the feather, Evan's feather. My hand shook as I held it over the flames. Every eye locked on me. Cassian's voice cut like a blade. "Drop it and be done." Rowan's voice, softer, urgent. "Marin, wait." I did not drop it. I lifted it higher. "This feather was not meant for your stone, not meant for your judgment. It was meant for a grave, a promise between the living and the dead. You call it surrender. I call it memory, and I will not burn memory to please the law." Gasps rippled. The air thickened with disbelief. Never before had a widow defied the stone. Never before had someone claimed the ritual as theft. Cassian's horse stamped, his jaw hardening. "You speak rebellion." Rowan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving his brother's. "She speaks truth." The circle stirred. Riders shifted uneasily, glances darting between Cassian and Rowan, between me and the fire. For the first time, doubt cracked their certainty. For the first time, the stones did not seem so invincible. Cassian's voice dropped, heavy as an executioner's axe. "If the law cannot silence her, then blood must." Rowan's hand went to his knife, Cassian's to his rein. The air sang with the tension of an unstruck chord. The dawn light struck the feather, catching its carved edges, making it glow as though Evan's hand still guided mine. I held it above the stones, above the fire, above their judgment, and for the first time, I spoke not as widow, not as traitor, but as Marin Ashford. "This feather will not burn for silence, it will stand for freedom." The circle erupted, shouts, gasps, the scrape of steel. Rowan stepped forward. Cassian drew his blade, and the stones themselves seemed to wait for blood. Dawn came thin and colorless. The sky, a sheet of cold tin, stretched over the circle, and for a breath the world forgot how to speak. Frost rhymed the council stones so cleanly they looked sharpened, and steam rose off the horses like breath made visible, like souls unwilling to stay hidden. I stood in the ring with my pulse in my mouth and my palm open to the cold, aware of every watching eye and every oath that had ever been traded here. Oaths that had carved people smaller than their body, wondering if silence would try to carve me too. I stepped to the tallest stone, its face scalloped by years of wind, and set Evan's feather where the frost would hold it steady. The carving took the chill like a blade takes light. Its edges caught a pale glimmer, not flame but the memory of it, as though the feather knew what fire had demanded and refused to kneel. I didn't let go as a surrender. but as a claim, and the small sound it made against rock wood on ice, vow, on altar rang louder than the horns had in the night. Which law would hear first? The sound or the meaning? Murmurs rippled through the riders. Cloaks shifted. Gloved hands tightened and loosened on rein. I could smell the ash in the pit, old cedar and fat, the leftovers of so many rituals that told women when to stop speaking, that smell threading with horse sweat and iron to make a new incense for a kind of mourning that didn't have a prayer yet. Faces I knew from child feasts and winter work parties held themselves still, because stillness is what law teaches a body first. But behind that stillness something quickened, and I thought, is curiosity a treason when it lives in a neighbor's eyes? Cassian sat his dark horse without a torch, as if light offended his grammar. The frost made a bright seam along his jaw, and when he turned toward me I saw Rowan's face in his bone, and none of Rowan's exits around the eyes. You make a spectacle of grief, he said, too even to be anger, too honed to be mercy. Steel doesn't need volume to cut only a steady hand. Would mine bleed for touching it? Rowan moved between us a half step, not eclipsing me, only interrupting the shortest path, the way a brother stands in a doorway when a storm demands the room. His breath smoked in the air where my hair had been a moment ago. She refuses to burn her memory, so your book balances, he said, voice low enough to be a warning and loud enough to be public. Which oath will cut first, the one to order, or the one to the dead who keep us honest? I looked at the ring of stones and felt the years inside them like an old bruise, then lifted my chin to the circle. You called my feather an end, I said, the words steadier than the hand that held them. You told me to drop the last of him into your fire and call it healing, but this was never yours. Evan carved this with breath still in his body and pressed it into my palm with a vow. It does not belong to smoke, it belongs to memory, and I will not feed memory to your flame. How long before memory itself learns to bite back? A young rider, barely a beard, anger trying on his face like a too large helm, kicked out of the line and drove forward 2 steps, his lariat half lifted for a throw, the horse eager as if it loved his certainty. The circle inhaled with him, the air pulling hard enough at my sleeves to feel like hand. Cassian didn't turn his head. He only snapped 2 syllables that felt like snapped bone, and the young man's arm froze mid-cast, the loop falling harmless as rope remembers it is only rope. Whose blood buys order when zeal outruns command? Rowan's voice held no tremor. Brother, he said, and in that single word were thawed rivers and 100 meals split, and the kind of winter that writes a man's name on his ribs. If you make this a killing, you will have to sleep with all the ghosts it breeds. Can even a captain sleep on such a bed? Cassian nudged his horse forward, the snow muttering under iron. His hand lowered to the hilt and stopped there, thumb easing the strap free with the kind of care a father uses to untangle a child's hair, and the leather's faint sigh carried like a promise across the circle. Steel whispered in its throat an inch, then 2, and a thin ribbon of sound unspooled that cut the air truer than any speech could. Does the language of metal settle arguments, or only postpone them? I would not let the sound answer for me. You set this ring to measure obedience, I said, taking a step toward the fire and then another, voice rising to live in my chest the way it hadn't since Evan breathed. I have obeyed enough. If I must kneel, I will kneel speaking, but hear me as I say it. I do not kneel. How does a circle hold when its center refuses to bow? An elder in a cloak the color of nightstone lifted his staff and began to recite the old words. Our law loves a script because it saves men the labor of thinking, but Cassian cut him with a palm he didn't bother to lift above his belt. The gesture so practiced it felt like a ritual within the ritual. Not yet, he said, and the staff hovered, its end tapping the frost once, twice, 3 times, like a heartbeat waiting for a verdict. Why stop your own elder unless the ground under your law has begun to tilt? I reached for the feather, not to take it back but to seat it firm, pressing it into the frost skin of the monolith, until a ring of melt made its own halo. Light caught in the grooves Evan's knife had left, every stroke of love become a small blade that cut my breath until it came out cleaner. "This is not an end," I said, and the words were smoke and oath and a cry I'd swallowed so long it had learned to wear my face. "This is a beginning. Can beginning live where endings are sold?" Across the circle the horses shifted, iron chimed, a saddle creaked as someone leaned to speak to someone else. Small sounds that usually go unnoticed grew teeth because everyone's attention had sharpened, and sharp attention turns any sound into a sign. I saw doubt move two riders glance at each other. One brow lift a question the mouth didn't dare. A woman at the back of the ring set her jaw on a new shape that looked too much like hope for the old shape to survive. How many cracks can a circle carry before it stops being a circle? Cassian slid down from his horse without looking away from me, snow squeaking as his boots took the weight. He drew the blade half out, refusing drama, refusing spectacle, and then the unpredictable happened. The same young rider who had lifted the lariat, eager to prove loyalty now that his first rush had been scolded, surged forward again and slashed at Rowan's reins as if severing leather could reattach a world. Cassian moved faster than fury, his half-drawn sword flashing to full for one heartbeat, not toward me, not toward Rowan, but toward his own man. Wrist, steel-kissed glove, glove split clean, the lariat fell, the horse reared, and Cassian's blade was back at half-breath, steady, as if the strike had been practiced. Did he just choose me over order, or choose a cleaner order over blind zeal? He held the half-draw there, eyes on me, then on Rowan, then back again, like a man measuring a bridge for weight and wind. "I swore," he said, and the words scraped. He'd said it enough lately to sand the skin from his tongue. "I swore to keep the circle whole. I swore to keep winter from eating our children. I swore to the stones because men need some place to put their promises when their bodies are too small to hold them. Which promise breaks last when the holding fails?" Rowan's breath came clouding into my hair with a heat that felt like shelter and warning both. "And we swore to bury our dead gently," he said, "not use them to silence the living. Can a law that forgets gentleness still call itself home?" Cassian's half-drawn sword trembled the smallest fraction, so slight it might have been frost leaving metal. He closed his eyes once, briefly, an old habit maybe, when he needed to look at an inside horizon and open them to the dawn, which had finally found a coin of color to spend in the east. "Then hear what I can't unswear," he said, each word placed like a stone in a river. "You walk now, you live now, but this circle writes the winter count, and the winter count remembered. At first thaw, when the drums call the ledger to be read, a debt will be named for this morning. It may ask for you, Rowan. It may ask for me. It may ask for something neither of us is willing to give without bleeding. And if no one pays, the circle will come collecting with more than torches. What debt waits with its hand out when spring breaks ice?" He turned his blade in his hand, point dropping until it wrote a narrow line in the frost, and the sound was small and obscene, like a quill scratching an unwanted name. Then he pushed the sword home, leather kissing metal with a soft, reluctant seal. "Stand aside," he said, not to me, but to everything behind his eyes, and when he stepped back, space opened like breath in a drowning chest. "Does mercy have an expiration date stamped where only brothers can read it?" A murmur ran through the rider's relief braided to resentment, obedience arguing with curiosity, and the line eased without dispersing, because a retreat that isn't quite a retreat still saves face. The elder lowered his staff as if his arm belonged to dawn instead of decree. Someone far along the circle sobbed once and then clapped a hand over their own mouth as if sound were contraband. Which sound is the most dangerous, the first gasp or the first laugh? Rowan didn't move until Cassian did. The brothers held each other's gaze across the churned white like men who had just traded pieces of their spines by accident, and Cassian said very quietly, so quietly I felt the words more than heard them, "I'll be the one at thaw." And Rowan's eyes answered, "I know," and I understood a new thing about blood. Sometimes it's not the tie that spares you, it's the thread that makes the noose hold. When spring comes, the riders peeled away in ones and twos at first, then in lines that remembered their drills, torches trailing thin banners of smoke that folded back into the gray like secrets deciding to be decent. Hoofprints scalloped the frost in a necklace of vanishing intention. The elder turned last, staff leaving small circular dents that would thaw first and forget, unless stones really do remember better than men. What does the ground keep when the people go? When the sound of departure thinned enough that breath returned to its ordinary proportions, Rowan's hand found my sleeve a touch so light it could have been a question, and I answered by stepping forward to the stone. The feather held its frost halo, a thin rim of thaw darkening the rock beneath, like a signature that had decided to be legible. I did not burn it, I said, palms on the cold face, the chill traveling up through bone and making certainty harden there. I did not surrender it. I kept it, as I will keep myself. Would the stones accept a grammar they hadn't written? Wind moved across the ring, not a lash now but a hand cupped to my ear, carrying the faintest scent of cedar old fires and new promises, and I thought of all the women who had stood here before me with their mouths full of words they'd been told weren't fit for air. I thought of Evan, who had carved the feather with his patient knife and left a little hitch in the curve where perfection didn't interest him as much as honesty. I thought of Rowan, who had learned to spend his breath where it bought the most life, and of Cassian, who had just purchased an hour of peace with a coin he might not be able to replace. How long before the ledger asks for change? The frost brightened as the sun finally tore a slit in the east. Light ran along the rim of the feather like a vein filling, and then leapt just for a heartbeat into a gleam so clean it made my eyes sting. Editors will know where to hold the feather on frost, catching dawn as if the day itself had chosen to rest on a small, stubborn shape that refused to vanish. Can an image keep a vow when voices fail? I stood straighter than the stones and let my voice carry to the emptying circle, to the men vanishing down the slope, to the women who would hear about this at cook-fires and measure their own breaths against mine, to the ledger waiting for thaw, to the dead who already knew. I placed the feather, I said. I placed it where the law could not eat it, where memory could not be ordered to forget. I am not widow, not shadow, not a lesson for anyone's fire. I am Marin Ashford. I am alive. Will the next woman need to ask permission to say the same? Rowan exhaled, a sound that belonged to relief and to warning, and to something like pride that had nowhere safe to sit. He didn't claim me with touch or word. He simply stood at my side with the space of a hand between us, the space where choices breathe. Cassian did not look back, but the line he had cut in the frost with his blade had already started to soften at the edges. Thaw doesn't ask permission either. When it reaches us, what will it take? I wrapped my fingers once around the stone's rim, felt grit and cold, and the steady pulse of a thing that had endured more winters than my grief, and I let my jaw unclench. The feather held, the sky lightened. The circle was not whole and not broken, but something new that didn't have a word yet, which is the only honest state for anything worth living through. Would the story remember this as defiance or as a beginning? I turned from the stones with frost cracking under my boot and the wind laying the first small warmth of day against my cheek, feather gleaming at my back like a thin, stubborn star no ritual could swallow. And when I spoke the last truth, I didn't have to raise my voice.